Hello, friends. The full moon is calling me. I have to go. Be sure to subscribe to my channel. I am recording this in case I don't make it back. At least there will be some account of what happened. Maybe you will have a chance. My name is John and I've been working as a detective for as long I can remember. I'm good at my job. I even have a 75% clearance rate. That means that I've solved over 75% of my cases. The national average is far less. My nickname in the department is the Preacher. It's funny how nicknames happen. I don't even believe in God. Thursday evening a case was reassigned to me. A young woman had been found in the basement of an abandoned church, barely breathing and in critical condition. She didn't last long. On the way to the hospital, her blood pressure dropped, and her heart stopped. The medics were unable to bring her back, and she was pronounced dead at the hospital. Typically the forensic division would be first on the scene, but there had been a double homicide on the other side of town and I got the luck of the draw. For about 6 months in the fall of last year, I had worked forensics. While it wasn't my favorite type of work, I was qualified to check the scene. I was to examine the church while it was still hot. First, though, I had been told by my captain to stop by the coroner's and hear his assessment. It was located only a block away from the station, so it would be on the way, and her body was en route. I made myself a cup of coffee and grabbed my jacket on the way out the door. Pulling into the coroner's, I saw the flashing lights of an ambulance near the back entrance. Seeing no sign of the crew, I slid through the hanging flaps of plastic and into the cooler part of the building where the bodies were kept. My friend Charlie was in the ambulance crew that had transported the girl's body. "Strange one tonight, John. You gonna be here for a while?" Charlie said, handing me a packet of papers to give to the coroner upon his return. "Hopefully not long, just stopping by on my way to the scene," I replied. "That church is creepy as hell, man." "Have fun," he said. As Charlie walked back to his ambulance, I checked the paperwork and began to examine the dead woman. Slowly circling the table, I saw no obvious cause of death. Pretty, 20s, blonde. No blood under the fingernails. No signs of struggle. Nothing. I walked over to one of the metal chairs, sat down and waited for the coroner to return. Closing my eyes for a moment, I gave them a rest from the harsh glare of the overhead lights. When I glanced back at the woman, that's when I saw them. 2 faint red marks on her neck. How had I missed them before? Somehow though, as I walked closer to examine her, I found myself looking at nothing. There was nothing there. I thought of the scene of the homicide. An old, abandoned church on Canal Road. A homeless man had been sleeping in the choir loft when he heard a woman screaming, so he ran outside and eventually flagged down a passing police car. They found her on the stone floor of the church basement. I watched the sun start to go down as I drove over to the scene at the church where the woman had been killed the day before. All the other officers had left, and I was alone. Pushing open the large oak doors of the church, I stared up at the altar. It had been many years since the place had been abandoned. Maybe it was the cold stone face of the statue staring down at me, but I began to feel very uneasy. Brushing that feeling aside, I headed towards the stairway at the back of the church. It was pitch black, and as my flashlight flickered, I cursed myself for not bringing a backup in case this one failed. I made my way down the circular stone stairway and found myself at the end of a long hallway. Scratches covered another thick wooden door, yet I could still make out the faint image of an old cross. Pushing the door open slowly and with some effort, I peered into the darkness of the basement and ducked quickly under the caution tape. As I looked around the enormous space, I saw multiple stone doorways and openings. There was a switch on the wall. Upon flipping it, a single bulb made a weak attempt at piercing the darkness, only lighting up the very center of the large room. Although the body had been removed, I could still feel a sense of death around me. Kneeling down to examine the floor where the woman had been found, I put my hand down and closed my eyes. I tried to picture her last moments, but something dark flashed inside my mind. It almost felt like something lives here and maybe it's coming back. Once again pushing my thoughts aside, I examined the room carefully and found two things of importance. The first, a silver cross, like the one my father had given me, on the ground of the basement. While a cross in a church is nothing out of the ordinary, this one was different. Its surface was burnt, charred like it had been set on fire and left to burn. I picked it up carefully and bagged it as evidence. Willing my flashlight to hang on a few minutes more, I came across something else out of place. A word scribbled on the wall, barely even visible in the darkness. I wrote the letters into my notebook. Uterafson. It was at that moment, I heard what sounded like a soft whistling. My body tensed as I studied the dark basement more intently. Again, what sounded like whistling. Perhaps it was just the wind? This time it seemed closer, almost directly above me. It sounded as if it were coming from the corner near the high ceiling. I pointed my flashlight in that direction and it flickered worse now. As it did, I felt a trail of dust fall lightly across my forehead, and I heard what sounded like footsteps on the church floor above. I decided to quickly make my way back up the stairway and investigate the footsteps above before my flashlight died completely. As I reached the top, I froze. There was someone sitting in the first church pew, directly ahead of me. My hand went reflexively to my holster. Police. This is a crime scene. What are you doing here? No response. Making my way through the old stone pulpit, I called out again. I'm a police officer. Let me see your hands. I called out. Still nothing. Making sure to keep my distance, I kept one hand at my side and the beam of the flashlight glued right on the figure. I walked slowly forward. His face came into view. He was an old man, who looked to be in his late 70s or 80s. He wore a raggedy winter jacket, and I could see newspaper trimmings coming from the holes in his boots. His eyes were closed, and he didn't look to be breathing. Walking over, I put my hand on his shoulder. His eyes opened, and he jumped back quickly. I think I almost gave him a heart attack. The feeling was mutual. You startled me, he said, putting what looked to be an old hearing aid back into his right ear. Don't hear as well as I used to. Guess I didn't see you coming, he continued. I apologized as a sense of relief came over me. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to startle you. Are you aware this is a crime scene? I asked. His expression changed. Aware? You could say that. I'm the one that heard her scream, he replied. I thought for a short moment before sitting down and joining him. I stared up at the pulpit ahead of us. I'm the detective investigating the case. My name's John, I said, reaching out my hand. As we shook hands, he gave no mention of his own name. John? That's my son's name. Our eyes drifted back towards the crucifixion. Do you believe, John? I paused. No. Caught a little off the guard, I continued. The police tried to find you after what happened and get your account of it. Would you mind going over the details? For a moment, I thought I saw the old man's eyes almost gleam. Not much to go over really. Where were you when you heard her? I asked, slightly impatient now. Huh? Oh, I was here, John. His eyes stayed glued to the statue of Christ carrying the cross on his shoulders. Did you see anyone else here today? I asked quietly. Instead of answering, the old man asked his own question. Why don't you believe in God, officer? I paused. If you don't mind, I would like to stick to relevant details of the case. He interrupted. Oh, but this is relevant, John. Nothing could be more relevant. Seeing the earnest look in his eyes, I decided to humor him. Maybe then he would open up about what happened. Well, I never really had a reason to believe. And I guess when you've seen what I've seen, you just know that there really is no rhyme or reason to things, I said. The old man listened, perhaps accepting my answer as genuine, and then he spoke again. He pointed upwards, towards the old choir balcony. I've slept up there for years. There's an old diner around the corner and I used to be friends with the owner. His son owns the place now. He remembers me from better times, I suppose. Every evening I stop by and pick up a burger. His eyes closed again as he pointed towards the balcony. I was there when I heard her. Before I could ask my next question, he continued. Seeing as what you're up against, officer, it might be time to re-examine your beliefs, he said softly. What I'm up against? What did you see? I asked. His eyes stayed closed as he spoke. I never really see it, but sometimes there are things around you that you don't need to see to be afraid of. I studied the old man. Well, if you can give me a description, it would give me a better chance of finding whoever did this. The old man stared me deep in the eyes. Detective, are you sure you want to find him? I looked back at him. That's my job. Just then, a door slammed behind us. Detective? I turned to see a friend of mine from the force. Detective, there's been another murder. Can we speak outside? He asked. I looked back at the old man. What did you say your name was again? I asked. I didn't, he replied. I stood back up. Please stay here. I shouldn't be long, I said, making my way to the office and back out through the oak doors. Now outside, the officer told me to follow him. He said it wasn't far. I lit a cigarette as we walked together through the darkness and towards the flashing lights near the river. As we made our way closer, I suddenly remembered fishing in this same river with my family as a child. My memory was of a beautiful, clear stream of water. I thought of better times here. But now, those times were long past. I looked out at a decaying, polluted river, the banks littered with empty cans and bottles. How things change. When we reached the river's edge, I saw Charlie. Seeing each other twice in one night, John. What are the odds? Pulling back the plastic sheet from the body, I stared down in disbelief as Charlie spoke again. How do you know they'd be there? He asked. He continued. The puncture wounds, I mean. In a state of disbelief, my eyes were glued to the neck of a beautiful young woman, who looked to have been in her early 20s. 2 faint red dots. Where did you find her? I asked. Charlie nodded towards the old river. Passerby saw her floating not long ago. He said he would have jumped in after her, but he can't swim. "Don't matter anyway. She's been dead for at least a day," he replied matter-of-factly. I covered the woman back up and glanced up towards the river. "Tell the coroner I'll be by first thing in the morning to pick up the report," I said. "Sure thing," Charlie replied. I headed back to the church and walked through the aisles only to find it empty. A quick look around confirmed that the old man had left. Later that night, I stared into the darkness of a different body of water near my boat. The past few months, I had been living on a small sailboat that used to be my father's. I was docked in a slip where I had kept the boat for years. I looked out and watched the light reflect off the water around me. Walking slowly back inside the vessel, I turned on a small lamp and sat at my desk. I thought of the burnt cross from the church. What was the significance? Then, I remembered the writing on the wall. Opening back up the notebook, I stared down at the letters. Uterafson. Maybe the word had been scribbled in the basement years ago? I opened my laptop and typed the word into my search engine. Nothing. I kept thinking. I took out my last cigarette and crumpled the pack, tossing it into the trash. It occurred to me that maybe the letters I had written down in my notebook from the church were mixed up somehow. I moved the letters around for a few minutes, then realized that I had neglected to do the most obvious thing. Maybe the word was backward. As I wrote the word out, my excitement was gone as quickly as it had come. A sense of dread came over me as I looked down at my notebook. This will be the end of the recording for tonight. I'm going back to the church. I have to. There has to be some explanation. God, I hope I'm wrong. If I make it back, I will record another update, but if I don't, maybe you will be able to pick up where I left off. Nosferatu.